afternoon. My name is Emmy. I'm from the University of Asia Pacific University. I'm doing IR, International Relations. I'm in my second year. I would like to ask a question to all of you. What is the safest way and most effective way to raise awareness in the civil society to countries, to democratic countries?
Well, usually the civil society players would be aware. Yeah, those who are actually in NGOs, etc., they would be aware because it's so important to their work. So that if there's any development in legislation, they will know about it. They'll be aware of it. And more often than not, I mean, you know, the legislature, parliament may actually invite people to give their points of view with the law, etc. I think what you're talking about perhaps is the public in general. Yeah, that's a bit trickier because that requires, you know, in my point of view, that requires a much more, you know, a broader kind of output. And that kind of scale normally would require something like RTM, you know. But it used to be easier when RTM was the only channel we had.
Are you asking about Malaysia or general?
General, in democratic countries in general.
Well, I think I'll answer for Malaysia first, okay. Because the challenges now for civil society to not just promote FOI, or right to information, but also to be important checks and balances for the new Malaysia now is one that is very important to be strong, because I'm not sure how long you've lived in Malaysia, but to know that I might be going a little bit further than what you're asking, but the colleagues who are now in federal power, our new government, were very much champions of many things that civil society were also talking about, discussing, championing, advocating. So in this new environment, I think it isn't just anymore civil society demanding and advocating, but the federal government also living out many of the commitments. So for example, the Ministry of Information and Communications that gave an opening speech just now must readily allow communication channels for public, civil society to actually appear on talks like this to help promote awareness on various things. So it is an environment that can be maximized, a lot of opportunity for civil society to become more mainstream in departing information, disseminating information, actually getting the public to be more aware of their right to know. Because the earlier point of Azmi that you can have a good law, but if it's not utilized, then it's just on the shelf. So that can be assisted by new forms of communication. There should not be controls in the media. So for example, billboard advertisements, TV commercials should all start talking about rights. And why not have a right to information advertisement in between the news, you know, when there's a break for news. So there's many things that actually can be done that civil society can actually cooperate, provide content, provide input, and so on. So.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that is actually what you're asking, but I'm just trying to explain a scenario that is possible.
Yeah, I think I'll just chip in a little bit with the South Asian experience, because the question that you asked is interesting. You see, in India, for example, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, the people, you see, got involved in RTI because the RTI activists or campaigners lived in the villages. Yeah? They were not really based in Delhi or in the big cities. They lived, for example, in Rajasthan, in villages, and worked with the people around RTI. Aruna Roy is a very good example. Now, that's a singular example. India has a very particular, very powerful RTI sort of process in that sense. We can't all emulate that. I don't think it's feasible in that sense. Sri Lanka's example was, as I said, also was a little bit different because it was more a group of lawyers and journalists and activists and people getting together and making sure a good law comes out. But there, what we found is that if the law is implemented independently and properly, you don't need to teach people about RTI. You see, ordinary people living in villages or wherever, as the case may be, are already fully cognizant of the injustices that they come across. So when they see a law being worked properly, not only a law in theory, but it being worked properly, they will make use of it. And in Sri Lanka, up to now, the majority of applicants and appellants before the commission are ordinary people. To my greatest, sort of joy, they are not journalists or lawyers or, civil society in Colombo. They are actually ordinary people who use the law in Sinhala and Tamil and come and argue the case before the commission. And that is extraordinary. So the implementation of the law, if it's done properly, I think is a major issue to really take the law to the people.
Let me also say something from the perspective of being in government now, but of course, I was colleague with Cynthia and people in the civil society. I think firstly, of course, Ellie, please have a seat.
Thank you.
I think first, very importantly, all of us talk about secrecy, not just from the perspective of laws such as the Official Secrets Act, but it's also a culture of, and this culture is embraced not only by the civil servants, but also by the society in general. So first and foremost, I would like to encourage, or rather to tell you that don't get used to your government saying this is not your business to know. Do not ever get used to that. Because even if we have laws such as the FOI, the Freedom of Information legislation, what happened is that when we are not used to working with information or access to information, then you have a scenario like what was happening in Penang from January 2015 to June of 2016, a period of about a year or plus. The highest request for information, with this excellent tool available, the highest request of information was really for, Azmi would be familiar, Sijil Faraid, Islamic Inheritance Certificates, which is, I think, should be available even without this, without appeal to freedom of information enactment. But what is happening is that we are not used to demanding accountability from our government. I think that is something that the people in general, especially Malaysians, should bear in mind post May 9 even.
So your question was about the democratic countries and civil society in democratic countries. I don't know which are these countries, but if we are talking about the countries in the West, let's say US or United Kingdom, I have to say that a lot of public and also civil society has been brainwashed by this propaganda that some information needs to be kept secret because it's important to keep people safe. And that's also was raised here earlier as a starting point for the governmental official was, is that a genuine reason for keeping certain information safe? Is it important to keep what is happening at a governmental meeting? Is it needed to be secret because there are genuine interests? And this is very difficult to challenge, but because people really believe in this propaganda, and they need to be constantly reminded that actually information which the state holds, they hold this information because people put them in a position to have it, and they hold it for the people. And the definition of what is necessary to keep safe is very broad and shouldn't be so. And this goes even to information about which was, let's say, put on WikiLeaks about the governmental cables or about Snowden revelations about the spying. So these are very important issues which show a huge violation of human rights and should have never been secret. So the challenge is to get them excited and campaigning for all the information to be transparent and this exception to be very narrow and not in a way which governments understands them, but which are in public interest.
Thank you. Your question has been answered. You're happy with the answer? Okay. I think the gentleman over here, gentleman over there. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you for a very wonderful presentation. My name is Dr. Ali Samad from KLS University. Yeah, it seems my question has been partially answered by Mrs. Barbour, but I will still ask the question. Okay, now, how do we overcome the challenges in trying to determine or differentiate or draw the line between what is official, what is classified, and what shouldn't be classified? How do you overcome that challenges, the blurring line between classified and non-classified information? Because the government will say, yeah, it's classified, so we cannot talk about it. So that's my concern. Thank you very much.
Well, as far as I can tell you, as far as government is concerned, their interest is always classified as much as possible. So one of the overcoming ways is to protection of whistleblower and encouraging whistleblower and also supporting the platforms through which people who are inside the administration and who are aware of those gross human rights violations can make this allegedly classified but important information in public interest available to the public. So it needs to go hand in hand with protection of whistleblowers and so.
Anyone else wants to share?
Sure. I think that the starting point from the perspective of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is that, the classification of information is a restriction on the right to receive information, which is a component of freedom of expression, right? And restrictions can only be subject, must meet like a tripartite criteria. It has to be provided by law, and not just any law. There must be some form of democratic process behind the law. It must be necessary and proportionate to meet a specified legitimate objective, right? So it can't just be a very broad assertion of national security. There must be a very detailed justification that the government provides on the basis of national security why certain information should be classified. And I think the prevailing kind of spirit is that, exceptions must be extremely narrow and that the default, as Barbara was mentioning, should be declassified information.
The important thing is that there has to be a higher aspiration for freedom. That should be the guiding principle, that freedom is a good thing, and anything which limits freedom is a bad thing. And if it has to be there, it has to be very, very, very minute. Also, we can't deny, if you're lucky enough to have a decent court system, and if you're even luckier to have intelligent judges, we cannot deny the role of the judiciary. Because the judiciary could be a check and balance as well, where they could declare that, for example, a particular law or particular action on the part of the government is unconstitutional and disproportionate, like the principle that you mentioned.
I would add comments to that. You see, one device, and I think this may be important for Malaysia as well, one device that we employed in drafting Sri Lanka's law was that to provide that Sri Lanka's RTI law prevails over every other enacted law as at that point. So no law. Now Sri Lanka has a similar Official Secrets Act. We've all got these colonial era laws, in our statute books, right? Colonial legacy that has really not left us. But Sri Lanka's law provides that all these laws, we don't have to mention the Official Secrets Act specifically. There was an argument whether we should emphasize that. We said don't, because we don't have to privilege that. Every law prior to the RTI Act of 2016 is lower in status. And the information law is higher in status, right? And there's the second device that we employed, and that is common in India as well, in other countries as well, is that right to information is subject, yes, to exceptions. Sri Lanka has the exceptions, 14 exemptions, including national security, but there's a public interest override. So the public interest override prevails across all the exceptions. And that is the predominant criterion that one has to use. But there again, and I would advise this also as a caution, reliance on the courts entirely is problematic in our region. The commission, the independence of the commission that is appointed to examine issues under RTI must be independent, and it must be independently nominated and appointed and not solely left to government. That, I think, is a very important fact. In Sri Lanka, the commission is independent. I would never have accepted appointment. It was solely a government process. It is an independent nomination from the Bar Council, from media groups, from editors, from civil society organizations. And the commission coming into place is not subjected to any political pressure whatsoever. So those are some cautions that I think Sri Lanka could offer to Malaysians in the process.
Okay, thank you, Doctor, for that question. Gentleman over there.
Yes, it's in the statute books, but it's not
Good
it's
afternoon.
irrelevant.
My name is Suresh from Asia Pacific University. Now, I deal with a lot of young people, and I want to know, this question stems from what Dr. Azmi Sharum said. He says, only 1% are interested and 99% are not. Now, my question is, how do we change young people's mindset? What can you do to make this topic an interest for the young people? What can we do? Because the numbers are too small. I'm more concerned about how to get young people to be excited and say, I want that information. Because we want to grow the civil society, we want more people to ask questions, but what can we do? In the universities, we try to do a lot of things, being a private university. There are a lot of restrictions, okay? And I want to know whether the government, the new government of the day, are going to help us to bring about the new culture, new mindset among young people. But what can we do? What can you do? Civil society, law, government. Can you please advise? Thank you.
I think, to put this in perspective, what Azmi has said about only 1% will probably use the FOI instrument if it was ever enacted. Japan has very low crime rate, but the police stations are still there. I think the whole idea is really to push for institutionalizations of democratic elements, for example, freedom in the various elements, including freedom of information. So I don't think the widespread of interest in using certain democratic institution has anything to do with whether we should or should not promote it. But again, the question goes back to how do we spark off interest in the civil society? How does the government, or rather this administration, plays our role to spread this sort of awareness? I think in that aspect, the university, of course, Suresh yourself, play a very important role, spreading the campaign awareness to students. As we can see, the government through Saudara Gobin's ministry has opened up RTM, the national TV, to be part of the platform to use to spread this sort of awareness. And myself, I've met with C4, I think at least twice in the last 2 months of my appointment, and Cynthia is already planning a 3rd meeting with us. So I think the engagement is there, at least with this new administration. But I think this is a joint effort. The government is willing to open up our platforms, including the national media channel. But civil society and individuals have to play our role to also step forward and be part of this process of change. And I like what Cynthia said, keep us accountable, not just in the sense of looking from afar or voting every 5 years, but also to ensure that promises in the manifesto are met, at least in the next 3 to 6 months.
If I can say something, I think that you don't need to worry actually about young people. I think you have to be worried more about old people, how you understand it. Because I think that young people are quite aware and quite follow on this issue. And I was actually watching my little nieces a few weeks back, and they are from from 5 to 9, and they were playing with some whistles. And I asked them, are you training to be referees? And they said, no, we are training how to be whistleblowers. So I don't think that at age of 5 I even understood what whistleblower was. But, so they are pretty aware. So let's focus on the governments when we want to campaign on this issue, and those in general public, regardless of the age.
Just a very short reality call from Sri Lanka. You may be surprised as to who will use this, because in Sri Lanka, the government also thought the same thing. They said only 1% will use this. That is why the law was enacted with all what we wanted in that, because they thought the people won't use it. And they've been surprised out of recognition because of the way it's been used. So I really think that we have to wait until the law is enacted to see actually who will use it.
Cynthia?
The scenario was such that the past 60 years is something to do with our education system, really. And it was about don't ask things that are political, don't ask things that will get you into trouble, don't ask things that matter. I mean, if you wanted to start an orchid society or something less threatening, they would probably support you for something like that. But if you started to ask questions about your neighborhood environment, public policy on something, or even about why your teachers are like that, you cannot ask. So it is just part of that culture that I was referring to and many of us were talking about. You have to create an environment, and I'm telling Stephen actually, that a big part of it is with the government creating an enabling environment that will make youth participation interesting in wanting to be part of the reforms. So, I mean, there's many things technology can assist in actually making it exciting. So instead of going on Facebook to chat with friends, you can also use Facebook to keep the government accountable through apps like we created before. But that one had limited space because there was a bigger federal power that was controlling everything, including Facebook comments, which they said they wouldn't, but then they did. And people were hauled up for criticizing all kinds of things. So that has to change. People need to actually speak freely and ask freely. And so I think there's a big gap to connect with what the youth are interested in and the issue of reforms. But it can be very easily managed with creative ideas. And I think that culture of change can only come with political will from the new government.
I don't know, man. I mean, you know, young people, anything that these guys do, no matter how young Stephen is, right? He is very young, but even though they're going to be uncool. I'm sorry. I mean, like, there's nothing anyone over the age of 25 can do to them which is cool. I deal with young people all the time, and I feel ancient and horrible, and they don't look at me anyway. They're looking at their phones. But having said that, which is a terrible thing to say being a lecturer, I think the media has a very important role to play, because it's the media which can put forward stories, like, you know, the stories that you guys are telling, right? These stories are important that people, and then people know, all right, okay. And then they'll come to their own conclusions. You know, I agree with Barbara, we shouldn't worry about the young, they'll figure it out themselves. And if we try too hard, we're just going to look uncool.
Okay, thank you. We have time for two more questions. The lady over there, please.
One more
Perhaps
comment.
the media should focus more on who is bribing who rather than who is baiting who.
Okay, the lady over there.
Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Marceline Girol. I'm French. Sorry, we speak today. I live in Malaysia for the past 10 years, and I followed the last election very closely because I cannot vote, I cannot move. My embassy has said that I cannot be involved, and I was very happy to do so because I saw a lot of good things. In fact, I find out that the Malaysian election was done, in fact, more on internet and social media than really on the normal media platform. And this was a shift. I saw the youth moving, and especially towards the new government, and mobilizing. And in fact, this was also very new to me, that such a big movement can come from the youth side. They were more aware about their rights and what should be Malaysia, the new Malaysia, and their hope. And my question is, as social media was so impactful in the last election and brought you the awareness that you have, and we entered the fourth industrial revolution, where we don't speak anymore about tools, but about people centered in the technology. What is your take as in terms of information, in terms of communication, and in terms of usage of the fourth industrial revolution to make the invisible visible and to change the movement for the next generation?
I have a moderator's suggestion, which is why don't you take a couple more questions and then, so in the interest of time, and you can wrap up.
Yeah, the question over there?
Hi, I'm Brian Larish from the Make It Right movement of Brickfield Asia College. I'm actually to YB Stephen. I'm curious to what extent does information be shared between your ministries? As an activist that deals with children, for example, stateless children in Sabah, I deal with the Ministry of Education, but it crosses to the Ministry of Home Affairs, and we always get the same reaction, right? We have to speak to somebody else, we'll get back to you, and nothing is shared. So that loophole is always there for those of us who want to do work on the ground. So what effort is being made by the government now, and to what extent does your cabinet meetings actually share all this information with each other? I mean, you know, for us it's quite difficult. We can't move forward when one ministry says go speak to another, and then that ministry never gets back to you, especially to give you an email that no one answers. Yeah, so I'm curious to know what effort is being made with that.
Okay, the last one over there, and then we'll give it to the panel to answer.
Thank you, Chako Vadaketh. And my question, perhaps to the Deputy Minister, since the Deputy Minister for Communication and Multimedia is not there, and perhaps to Cynthia as well, from the civil society perspective. An area that I think there's wonderful opening up of access to information, especially in the new government, but an area that is still shrouded in secrecy is the royal family and 9 heads of state. And in particular, the incident where Kadej Jasin wrote about the Yang di-Pertuan Agong having had to be paid, or the country having to spend 157 million on its upkeep for 16 months, and the Treasury saying, oh, we allocate 13.5 million per annum for his upkeep, and he had to step down. And nothing further seems to have been said about that, and Anwar Ibrahim was very upset that such questions are being asked. But surely there should be access to information on how much we're spending on our royal heads of state, and also their dealings in business. If they deal in business, that seems to be shrouded in secrecy as well. Are we going to have access to information on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Chako.
Thank you. My name is Ramachandran from Taylor's University. My question may be posted to Azmi. See, when we teach media law, the first thing we ever introduce is Article 10. But in the same voice, in the same hand, I also hold Article 19. My question is, Azmi rightly pointed out that while Article 10 says we are free, in the same breath, there are 12 other laws relating to restrictions. Like Chako said, don't ask questions about the royals. Now my question is, why hasn't Article 10 thus far been able to make a dent in our laws?
Okay, over to our panel.
No, this guy's been raising his hand like it hurts.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Wan Kasim from the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator for Malaysia. So a lot of the discussion on freedom of information was made in the context of human rights, and rightly so. Right to information is a fundamental human rights and should be enjoyed by every human being. We welcome very much the commitment of the new government to give greater priority to human rights. But even so, in this light, there is this argument that human rights should be tailored to domestic values and domestic particularities, as opposed to the the internationally recognized standard of the universality of human rights. So, what is your take, perhaps, Dr. Azmi Sharom, perhaps YB Stephen and Ms. Cynthia? What is your take on the potential impact such a interpretation or thinking, conception of human rights can have on access to information in Malaysia? Thank you.
Dr. Azmi, you like
okay, very quickly, Ramachandran, the question is, the answer is because Article 10 actually shoots itself in the foot. We have Article 10(1), which says every citizen has a freedom of expression and speech. But then Article 10(2) says Article 10(1) can be restricted in these circumstances. Okay, that's bad enough. What's worse is that, generally speaking, our courts are reluctant to actually limit the limitations on our laws, on our freedoms. Because if you're allowed to make a law restricting our freedom of expression or freedom of information based on the concept of national security, but you don't define what national security is, and you give it this broad idea of anything could be national security, then our freedom is illusory. And in that situation, it is up to the court to say, look, you can't do this. You can't just use the term national security to make any law that you want, which in effect makes our freedom absolutely false. Right? So the problem is twofold. One is that because the Constitution itself, it gives too much leeway to the government to make laws, to restrict us. Our courts do not actually defend us hard enough because they're not willing to make that argument which forces the government to behave in a way which is reasonable. Our Constitution also does not have a preamble, which means we do not have any sort of higher aspiration to what kind of ideals we want as a nation. So this is the problems we have constitutionally. Very quickly to the last question, universality. That is, what's the term? Cultural relativism. That is used by dictators all over the world, particularly in Asia. Lee Kuan Yew did it, Mahathir Mohamad did it, he seems to be doing it again. All right, we are different somehow. Okay, fine. I guess Asian people don't like freedom of expression. Asian people like corruption. Asian people don't like to have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all this kind of stuff, because we're Asian. It is an argument used by despots, and it must never, ever be accepted.
So, I mean, just jumping off those comments, I just want to address at a very high level, like this interplay between domestic law and international law. I think at this critical political moment, it is incumbent on the Malaysian government to seriously consider signing and ratifying the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, right? Because this argument from Asian values that somehow civil and political rights deserve less priority in this region really doesn't hold any water because of the independence between all human rights. In order to solve issues relating to economic inequality and poverty, information is power. Information, is required to help solve those kinds of problems on the ground, right? So this is the kind of deep connection between access to information and what we call economic or social issues, which are actually matters of human rights. So as to the question about social media and the role of social media, I think there are several tensions that are important to raise. One of which is, yes, it is true that social media has really changed the way we think and talk about elections as well as other political activities. And some people have argued for, greater responsibility on the part of companies to actually police the platform, or in the alternative, to allow it to be truly a genuine platform for expression. And I think the platform, social media platform, is really like just any other platform. Freedom of expression principles govern. They should be the touchstone of any kind of regulation, whether state or private. And we want to also seriously think about the dominance of these platforms, right? When a single platform, in people's minds can make or break elections, we really want to think about what that means for democratic culture, whether we actually want to have that kind of platform dominance exist, and whether we must look to other forms of regulation, for example, in competition law or data protection law, to kind of rein the power and influence of these platforms.
Right. Tough question, but I started my presentation just now with the true story of my copy of Serat Centini. Check it out. Kama Sutra of the Javanese world. The fact is, it was 12 volumes, but when it was republished here in Malaysia in Bahasa Melayu, it was reduced to a very thin 1-volume edition. I think without going to engage that philosophical argument about universality versus cultural particularism. And I didn't say this because I'm in government now. Read my book, Being Malaysia, which was published just before the campaign. I think it is also not fair for us not to take into consideration certain sensitivity because of, say, religious values, cultural or traditional worldviews or perspective of a community when it comes to governance, when it comes to legislations and rule of law. It is very easy, of course, and popular to say, everything is universal. Everyone have the same idea of freedom. Everyone have the same idea when we talk about human rights. Everyone have the same idea when we talk about freedom of information for that matter. But what I think is important at this point is, going into the question by Dr. Maslin from France. I think whether social media or traditional media, whether Industry Revolution 4.0 or not, the problem, the challenge that we have in Malaysia right now is really very fundamental in terms of how government agency is being connected, sharing of information, management of information. I mean, even if we have a FOI legislation today, I would imagine if you fill up a form to request for something as simple as Penang export and import activities, it will probably take you, 2 months. So very fundamental, how do we manage information? This is technical, of course. But on the other hand, we are also not just talking about FOI or OSA. I've raised in Parliament before about the Statistics Act. No one cares about the Statistics Act, but it is like 50 years old today, now, by this time. So how government collect information, how government corroborate information, how government publishes information, all these have to be dealt with. And I think the monarchy being an institution, an important institution, this is where I go into that sensitive area, being an important institution has to realize that if this is the direction the country is taking, then they have to follow suit in terms of transparency, in terms of freedom of information, in terms of human rights. And all this is not just government domain. Again, agreement to certain values in our society, certain values in government, has to come from the people themselves. Did we vote for the censorship of Serat Centeni, the Javanese Kama Sutra? I don't know. Maybe half of the population did, and would agree to that because I was told that it was pornography. Did we vote for certain actions of the government now and then? I don't know, maybe part of the population did. So I think there must be some kind of national conversation, consensus about values that we cherish in our society as Malaysians. And this is the process of consultation, of course, moving towards reforming our institution as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have for you. We'd like to once again thank all our speakers.
Yeah, we want to say
you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's the question on social media is a very important one because that's the space. Even in the more hostile times, that was the space that was available. And we know that Malaysia wasn't the only country. There were other countries that used social media to attract public attention on what was going on. So one of the things we did, just to share two things, very important in social media, we actually launched a website called Kleptocrazy, which was out to get the public to report on people who were living with suspicious wealth. And that was motivated by the 1MDB scandal, of course. So we could not get institutions here to investigate. That was the level of how repressed the things were at that time, that even the MACC could not investigate properly, neither could the PDRM and so on. So what actually got us motivated was, okay, maybe you can launch something online to see how much interest can be generated. But it was difficult because it was one thing to launch an app on local government, service delivery and all, which got a lot more feedback. But it was quite a challenge to actually get people to lodge complaints on politicians and powerful people living with suspicious wealth or living beyond their means, because we don't have an asset declaration law here, which is another reform that is taking place. And the asset declarations have to be public so that the public can scrutinize politicians and have them come in with integrity. Those that are corrupt have no place in society and so on. So despite the difficulty in getting information and all, we got some people posting images of the former regime and some of their politicians that somehow some of them got voted back in, some of them were rejected. It was very interesting to see the number of cars they had, how many houses they actually had, and things like that, and how many companies they were shareholders of, and so on. Some things are available because public listed companies have to declare anyway who are the shareholders and stuff. Some will actually require a bit of snoop work, that you're actually following someone because they're driving a Lamborghini, when actually they are someone in the civil service who cannot afford that kind of luxury lifestyle. So it was a very interesting exercise. And then I think the most famous, or the board game of the general elections was something you might have heard of. It's called the Kleptopoly. We created a board game. It was so difficult to get the Malaysian people to check on financial flows of the 1MDB. Unless you're in the industry and really researching and studying, it's so easy to get lost, because money was not just stolen from one person and given to another. It was a maze of different things. So what we did was, when the Department of Justice came up with the first civil forfeiture suit, we actually used the information there. I mean, it was formal DOJ information, and we put it, inspired by Monopoly, so we put it on a board, all the stolen 1MDB property. And it's like playing Monopoly. But the moral of the story is, you get rich, but you must get rich only if you're clean. And that's how you can win the game. And it taught a lot of young people about fighting corruption and stuff. And we had Bloomberg, AFP, and all that cover the news for us, and Malaysia Kini, of course. And it just helped get a lot of things going. So I think my point, I'm sure my point is, the challenge to civil society is really also, and to the new government, is also about being creative, trying to find different ways, thinking out of the box. And I mean, we've got an excellent Azmi Sharum, always thinking out of the box. So more academics also need to start coming out and finding ways to connect with young people and so on. And I think I just wanted to touch on that question of the royalty and the excesses. It's a no taboo topic still. But it was very disappointing that Kadir Jassin was lambasted for exposing something that may have needed further investigation. And so the point here is, how do we actually enhance investigative journalism? Which means the environment that needs to be created, that they can report. They can actually go dig deeper, report without getting into trouble. The Malaysian Insider was shut down because they were trying to report things. Now, it might not be entirely true, but the Malaysian Insider exposed something. So you investigate, and if they were found to be malicious or whatever, you have other laws that can take action on them. But if they were whistleblowers that were showing something that was important for the Malaysian public to know, then I'm suggesting to the new regime, and I hope Stephen doesn't feel so pressured, because he's one of the great guys in the new government, that's the culture that needs to be enhanced, that you need to give that space for journalists to actually investigate, even if it's really a taboo subject about the royalty or whatever it is, Malay rights, and so on. So that's not going to change in 4 months or 6 months. That's going to take a lot of will to have a different Malaysia. And I think really it's each and every one of us that will have to play our parts to make that happen. So we need to keep pushing the government, we need to keep negotiating with them, proposing reforms, checking them, and having better access to more transparent public policy shaping and all that.
Okay, quick remark from Tishala and Barbara.
Three concluding comments to apply some of the matters we discussed here into the RTI struggle. In Malaysia's process on RTI, I would just like to give 3 lessons from Sri Lanka. One is that perceive the public servant as your colleague rather than an enemy of RTI, or rather than the target of RTI. Now, in Sri Lanka's law, it was because a lot of public servants felt very apprehensive when the law was enacted. I think, Stephen, this came out a little bit in your comments as well. And the government does feel apprehensive, because any government who enacts a RTI law is doing so against itself. Let's be honest about it. In England, the British FOI law, Tony Blair many years later said that he was the biggest idiot in the world to have enacted the RTI law, the access to information law in the UK. And every government is going to feel that. In our case, what we did was we tried and crafted the RTI law to actually protect honest and good public servants, and not to make the entire public service feel that they're being targeted by the RTI law. That's one. Second issue is, when drafting, don't settle for compromises that are unacceptable. In our case, unlike India and other countries in Asia which shut out certain intelligence agencies from RTI, Sri Lanka's law applies across the board to all defense ministry, intelligence apparatus, all the most sensitive areas of government. And the issue was that no entity should be privileged. The privilege should come not in terms of entity, but in terms of the information asked for. So if information asked for trespasses on national security, then you weigh the balance and you give information, or you don't, as the case may be. The third point that I would like to really emphasize is that seize the opportunity now, because given Sri Lanka's process, which is very similar to Malaysia from what I can see, if we had tried to enact the RTI law of 2016 now, it would have been impossible. So much has changed during the last 2.5 to 3 years. So I think Malaysians should seize the opportunity now and enact the law as quickly as it can, because if the mood changes, there will be real problems ahead in the future. Thank you.
Okay, one last remark from Barbara.
And also, two concluding points from me about the universality and about the need to be sensitive to local cultures and sensitivities. I'm not Malaysian, so I don't know what values you hold dear, as you said. But in my experience, my government also tells me when they violate human rights that they are respecting my sensitivities or my culture. And it's usually just the culture which governmental officials or certain groups in society hold dear, not the whole public. So as an individual and citizens, then we can say that actually this is not a culture worth of respecting. If the culture violates rights of women or minorities, it is excuse for human rights violation, not a culture. And even the culture or weak constitution or a holy book or my horoscope is not excuse for violation of human rights. So please stop using the cultural sensitivities as excuse. And the second one is the lady from France, when you ask about the social media, and Amos already touched on this. I think the most important thing here is the fact that this infrastructure and social media are in hands of private companies, and they have decision-making over what is allowed on those platforms. So I'm not advocating for public control and state control of these platforms, but we need to have a genuine discussion in the society what standards we want to apply to those companies and what do we want them to do, because we don't want to give up our contract with the state just for a private contract with those companies, especially those that have a dominant position on the market. So we need to really engage with them and have a genuine dialogue and discussion about how those platforms should be regulated and maintained.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, with that, we'll have to conclude the IPDC talks this time around. We'd like to thank all our speakers. We'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. We'd like to thank AIBD for organizing this IPDC talks, the first in Malaysia. It's a historic event, of course, in collaboration with UNESCO and Radio Television Malaysia. So from all of us here in Kuala Lumpur, it's goodbye to the next time at the IPDC talks.